Christmas stories to read on a cold winter's eve. For centuries, there has been a tradition where people gather around a roaring fire and scare themselves by reading ghost stories aloud during the holiday season. The scariest Christmas monsters from folklore. Every country has different customs during the Christmas season. Some of these customs have their roots in ancient pagan beliefs. Christmas monsters are used by parents to keep children in line. If they don't behave themselves, they won't get any Christmas gifts and a terrifying monster will come and kidnap them. Jólakötturinn. Jólakötturinn is the Icelandic Yule cat, or Christmas cat. He is not a nice cat. In fact, he might eat you. This figure is tied to an Icelandic tradition in which persons who finished all their work on time received new clothes for Christmas, while those who were indolent did not, although this is primarily a threat to push children to work hard. Parents told the myth of the Yule cat, stating that could tell who the lazy children were because they did not have at least one new article of clothing for Christmas, and these children would be sacrificed to the Yule cat. Frau Pertita. Tales told in Germany and Austria occasionally describe a witch named Frau Vorperkta, who dishes out both gifts and punishments throughout the 12 days of Christmas, December 25 through Epiphany on January 6. She is best recognized for her awful retribution of the sinful. She will pull out your internal organs and replace them with junk. The terrible face of Perchta may show in Christmas processions in Austria, something like Krampus. Yule. The Lasvanir, or Yule lads, are 13 Icelandic trolls who each have a name and distinct personality. In ancient times, they stole objects and produced issues during Christmas time. Hence they were used to scare children into behaving, like the Yule cat. However, the 20th century developed traditions of the beneficent Norwegian figure Julenus, Santa Claus, who brought gifts to virtuous youths. The practices got entwined until the originally malicious Lasvinar became compassionate enough to leave gifts in shoes that youngsters leave out, if they are nice boys and girls. Gryla. All the Yule lads answer to Gryla, their mother. She predates the Yule lads in Icelandic legend as the ogress who kidnaps, cooks, and consumes youngsters who don't follow their parents. She only became associated with Christmas in the 17th century, when she was designated to be the mother of the Yule lads. According to folklore, and Hafle had 3 different marriages and 72 offspring, all who produced troubles ranging from innocent mischief to murder. Christmas tree decorations is a spooky story about a girl who is home alone on Christmas Eve and has a nasty encounter with a man claiming to be Santa Claus. Juliette, an 11-year-old French girl, was decorating the Christmas tree on Christmas Eve. Her mother was a nurse at the local hospital, and the two of them lived alone in a modest apartment in Paris's outskirts. Juliette's mother called late that evening to say she wouldn't be home until late that night. Juliette kept decorating the tree with all of the nice things her mother had purchased at the shop. She wrapped the tree in multicolored Christmas lights and strung lovely decorations from the branches. She completed decorating the Christmas tree and sat down to relax and watch TV after placing the angel on top. Juliette felt safe looking out over the lights of Paris from her 6th-floor flat, despite the fact that she was alone. She could see the Eiffel Tower and the Champs de Mars from her window. The majority of the other renters had gone home to celebrate Christmas Eve with their relatives in the countryside. The housing complex was nearly empty. Juliette was getting tired of waiting for her mother to come back. She thought she heard a scratching sound at the front door. She turned off the TV and listened intently. There was a strange quiet. She approached the door gently, peering through the peephole. She was surprised to see a man outside dressed in a red suit with fluffy white trim. He was big and chubby, with a dirty gray beard and a red hat on his head. He loudly knocked on the door. "Who's there?" she inquired through the door, nervous and frightened. "It's Santa Claus," said the man. "Please let me in. I'm freezing, exhausted, and hungry." Juliette felt a shiver run down her spine as she heard this. She was no fool. She was certain that whoever this weird man was wasn't Santa Claus. "My mother isn't home right now," she remarked, shaking her head. "Please leave." Juliet stared through the people as the man's eyes filled with rage and his face twisted into a hateful scowl. He started hammering harder on the door and "It's Santa Claus." "Juliet," he exclaimed. "Have you set some milk and cookies out for me, Juliet? You already know how much Santa enjoys his milk and cookies." The young girl felt sick in the pit of her stomach. How did he know what her name was? The man then started kicking and hammering on the door. She peered out again and saw him take a switchblade from his coat pocket. He pushed the knife into the keyhole, attempting to pry it open. Juliet was scared. She was at a loss for what to do. "If you don't leave, I'll call the cops," she yelled. The knocking suddenly came to a halt. Juliet remained motionless, frightened to move. After a few minutes, she began to suspect that her threat had scared the man away. She approached the door gently and peered through the people to see if the man had indeed left. The corridor appeared to be vacant. She was startled to see the man running down the corridor with an axe in his hand. Juliet screamed and dashed to the closet. She crouched and hid behind the coats, tears streaming down her cheeks. She heard the explosion as the man attempted to bash down the front door. He yelled. Boom! The door fell apart with a mighty crack, and the man crashed through the splintered wood. "Juliet, my pretty," he exclaimed, laughing to himself. "Juliet, where are you? Don't be scared. We'll have a good time tonight. Where?" The insane intruder strolled around the house, looking for the terrified girl. Juliet hid in the closet, quivering in terror. She hated the thought of what he had planned for her. Suddenly, the closet doorknob slid up and down. Then the door began to shake, and she... "Juliet, I know you're in there," he told her. "Open the door for Santa. Open up before..." The man swung his axe, and it slammed against the closet door, shredding into the weak wood. Juliet yelled and sobbed bitterly. She took a wire coat hanger and bent it into a point. She waited, her eyes wide open, and her palms shaking. Another thunderous smash followed, and the closet doors collapsed in a hail of splinters. The heinous man ripped the doors off their hinges and pushed his head between the coats. As his big, gnarled hands grabbed the terrified girl, he was grinning and drooling like a lunatic. Juliet bravely thrust the pointy end of the coat hanger into the man's face. It landed squarely in his eye. As blood ran down his cheek, he recoiled in pain, shouting with wrath. He yanked the wire from his eye socket and grabbed Juliet's hair. Then he hauled her out of the closet, kicking and screaming. The man shoved her on the ground and grabbed her neck, hovering over her. Blood splattered all over her face as blood flowed from his eye. He whispered in her ear, his mouth contorted into a horrible smile. "You will be privileged tonight, my lovely Juliet. I've made a list and double-checked it. I'm here to determine if you've been naughty or nice. You can scream and beg for your life all you want, but naughty females get the axe and nice girls get the knife." Juliet's mother returned home shortly after midnight. She noticed the front door and raced inside to look for her daughter, which had been slashed to pieces. Her eyes struggled to take in the horror as she looked about. Then she started screaming in terror. Juliet's entrails adorned the Christmas tree, and her decapitated head rested on top. I had previously kept my watch opposite the window, but now I had moved to a corner near the door, where I was shielded from view by the thick hangings of the bed and an antique wardrobe. I sat there, still, but no sound shattered the silence. After many nights of waiting and growing bored of my solitary vigil, I finally fell asleep, only to be awakened by the soft opening of the door. "John," my sister said, nearly whispering, "are you here?" "Yes, Claire," I said, "but what are you doing up at this hour?" "Come downstairs," she said. "They are in the oak parlor." I didn't need an explanation as to who she was referring to, so I sneaked downstairs after her, warned by an elevated hand of the importance of silence and caution. She paused beside the open door of the oak parlor, and we both gazed in. There was the room we'd left in the dark overnight, with a blazing wood fire on the hearth, candles on the chimney piece, the tiny table moved out from its usual corner, and two guys seated opposite it, playing cribbage. We could see the younger player's face. It was that of a man between the ages of 5 and 20, of a man who had lived hard and ruthlessly, who had wasted his money and his health, who had become Jeremy Lester in the flesh. It's impossible for me to explain how I knew this, how in an instant I recognized the player's characteristics as those of the man who had been gone for 41 years. 41 years that same night. He was dressed in an era-appropriate outfit, with powdered hair and lace ruffles around his wrists. He appeared to be someone who had returned home from a big party and sat down to play cards with a close friend. A ring glistened on his small finger, and a magnificent diamond glittered in the front of his shirt. His shoes had diamond buckles, and he dressed for the occasion in knee breeches and silk stockings, which highlighted the contour of a surprisingly excellent leg and ankle. He sat across from the door, but never looked at it. His focus appeared to be on the cards. For a while, the only sound in the room was the significant counting of the game. We waited in the doorway, holding our breath, horrified and enthralled by the scene unfolding before us. We could hear the rustle of the cards as they were dealt out and fell upon the table. We listened to the count 15-2, 15-4, and so forth, but there was no other word spoken until the player, whose face we couldn't see, exclaimed, "I win. The game is mine." Then his opponent picked up the cards, carelessly shuffled them in his hand, stacked them close together, and tossed the entire pack in his guest's face, yelling, "Cheat! Liar! Take that!" There was a frenzy and turmoil, with chairs being flung over, intense gesticulation, and so many passionate voices blending that we couldn't hear a single sentence. Jeremy Lester, on the other hand, marched out of the room so quickly that he almost touched us where we were, out of the door, and tramp up the staircase to the Red Room, where he descended in a few minutes with a couple of rapiers under his arm. When he returned to the room, he seemed to give the other guy his choice of weapons, and then he ripped open the window, and after ceremoniously allowing his opponent to pass out first, he stepped forth into the night air, Claire and I following. We walked through the garden and down a tiny twisting path to a smooth patch of turf shielded from the north by a grove of young fir trees. By this time, it was a bright moonlight night, and we could clearly see Jeremy Lester measuring off the ground. "When you say 3, he finally said to the man with his back to us. They had drawn lots for the land, and it had fallen to Mr. Lester. He stood there with moonbeams falling on him, and I'd never seen a more lovely man. 1, the other began. 2, and before our kin had the faintest inkling of his plan, he was upon him, his rapier through Jeremy Lester's breast. Claire cried aloud at the sight of that terrible deceit. The fighters had vanished in an instant. The moon had become veiled behind a cloud, and we were standing in the shade of the fir plantation, trembling with cold and horror. But we finally realized what had happened to Martingale's late owner, that he had died, not in a fair combat, but foully killed by a false friend. When I awoke late on Christmas morning, it was to find a white world, the ground, trees, and shrubs all burdened and blanketed in snow. There was snow everywhere, snow that no one could recall falling in 41 years. It was on just such a Christmas as this that Mr. Jeremy disappeared. The old sexton remarked to my sister, who insisted on dragging me through the snow to church, whereupon Claire fainted and was carried into the vestry, where I made a full confession to the vicar of everything we had seen the previous night. That respectable individual seemed to take the situation lightly at first, but when the snow melted and the fir plantation was studied a fortnight later, he admitted there may be more things in heaven and earth than his restricted thinking had conceived of. Jeremy Lester's body was discovered in a small area near the property. We knew it by the ring, the diamond buckles, and the gleaming breastpin, and Mr. Cronson, who came over to check these antiques in his duty as magistrate, was visibly disturbed by my story. Pray, Mr. Lester, did you in your dreams see the face of the gentleman, your kinsman's opponent? No, I said. He sat and stood with his back to us all the time. Of course, there is nothing else that can be done, Mr. Cronson noted. Nothing, I replied, and the affair would have ended there, except that a few days later, while we were dining at Cronson Park, Claire abruptly dropped the glass of water she was holding to her lips, exclaimed, "Look, John, there he is," rose from her seat, and pointed to a portrait hanging on the wall. I saw him for an instant when he turned his head towards the door as Jeremy Lester left it, she said, adding that is he. I just have a hazy recollection of what happened after this identification. Servants hurried here and there. Mrs. Cronson collapsed in hysterics. The young girls huddled around their mommy. Mr. Cronson, quivering like a man in an fit, attempted some kind of explanation, while Claire kept praying to be carried away, only to be taken away. I moved her away from Cronson Park, but also from Martingale. However, before we left the latter location, I spoke with Mr. Cronson, who confirmed that the portrait Claire had recognized was that of his wife's father, the last person to see Jeremy Lester alive. He's an old man now, Mr. Cronson said, a man of over 80 who has confessed everything to me. You won't bring us more grief and shame by making this situation public. I promised him I'd keep quiet. But the tale slowly leaked out, and the Cronsons departed the country. My sister married and now lives in London. She never returned to Martingale. Despite my assurances that there are no unusual noises in my home, she will not visit Bedfordshire, where the little girl she encouraged me to think about seriously so long ago is now my The Black Lady of Bryn Tor is a Victorian ghost story, written in 1904 by Guy Boothby. The story concerns a married couple who move into a new house and find a strange woman in a black veil trespassing on their property. I've seen some strange sights and been a part of some strange situations in my profession, but I can confidently say that the narrative I'm about to tell you now equals, if not beyond, anything I've ever known. I had just returned from South America, where I had been ranching for some years and had been more successful than the majority of men who go into that trade, and I had returned to the old country with the aim of making it my permanent home. It does not appear difficult to find a house of the description you require provided you are willing to spend the money. Only those who have tried it understand how serious it can be. One will be too large and lack sufficient land, while the other will be too little and have more land than you care to worry with. My wife and I had been to so many locations that we were beginning to lose hope of ever finding what we were looking for. Then, by chance, I came across the property with which this story is associated. I had to go to Plymouth to meet up with a friend who was returning from Australia. The beauty of Devon is legendary, and it is never more beautiful than in the autumn. It had an appeal for me after my lengthy absence abroad that I find difficult to convey in words. Dartmoor's dark red soil, luxuriant hedgerows, trickling brooks, and enormous seclusion drew me in with tremendous intensity. This was the county for me. If only I could find the place I had been hunting for so long and so wearily. While I waited for my friend's ship to arrive, I made it a point to contact one of the main real estate agencies to inquire. My hopes were dashed. He had nothing on his books that I was interested in. I tried again and again, but with the same outcome. There were plenty of houses in town, but they were useless. There were others in the immediate vicinity, but each had some disadvantage. "Good afternoon," I said to the last agent before returning to my hotel, frustrated with my lack of success. That evening, a buddy arrived, and I forgot about my search for a place to live for the time being. However, I was closer to success than I had anticipated. When I went down to the coffee shop the next morning, I discovered a letter on my plate. It was from the first agent I had contacted the day before. He had heard of an estate in a delightful tiny village on the edge of the moor by coincidence. He explained. The house was old and magnificent, and the land was approximately 70 acres. Some minor repairs would be required because the house had not been occupied for some time due to the owner being abroad and unable to maintain it. Finally, it was reported that the estate would be either leased or sold outright. I carefully examined the details provided, and as I did so, I began to believe that I had found what I was looking for. When my friend arrived, I told him the news and offered him to stay a day longer so he could inspect it with me. He agreed, and we leased a carriage and traveled out that afternoon. There are several reasons why I refuse to reveal the village's name. They should be evident to you, I'm sure. Giving a dog a bad name and hanging him may relate to both a property and the canine race. The hall, as it was known, was located on the outskirts of the settlement, on the moor's edge. The agent had characterized it precisely when he said it was a gorgeous ancient building. It stood on high land, with the steep edge of Bryn Tor behind it, crowned with large stones that gave it a wonderfully wild appearance. The mansion itself was approached by a long carriage drive, and as I later discovered, was built during the reign of George I. I liked it from the first time I saw it. We drew up to the steps and got out. I gave the housekeeper the order to look, and she scrutinized it as if it were a currency worth £1,000, and she wasn't sure whether it was genuine. She eventually agreed to let us in, and we entered the enormous square hall. It was paved, and to be honest, did not look particularly attractive. The oak paneling, on the other hand, was lovely, and the grand staircase was huge and exquisitely carved. The old lady pulled open the door to the room I assumed to be the dining room, and we began our inquiry tour. With the exception of the kitchen and a bedroom, the house was completely unfurnished and in desperate need of repair. It did, however, have a lot of potential, and I was confident that once furnished and put in order, it would make a lovely home. By the time our inspection was over, it was late afternoon, and if we were to get back to Plymouth in time for dinner, we needed to start right away. That evening, I wrote a comprehensive account of what I had witnessed to my wife, inviting her to join me, so I could hear her thoughts. She arrived the next day. She was as taken with it as I was, and by the end of the week, everything was in order for me to take possession of it. As soon as the essential legal formalities were completed, my wife set off for London with furniture shopping in mind, while I stayed behind to finish the work that needed to be done before we could move in. Finally, in the second week of November, if my memory serves me well, the furniture began to arrive. I was given a makeshift bedroom and left the motel in Plymouth for my own place. My life was not quite rose-colored for the next few days. Everything had to be set up. The staff were new, and the furnishers' men needed close supervision to keep them from spending the majority of their time at the village inn. However, it was finally completed, and I believe that if my wife added the few finishing touches that only a woman can accomplish, it would be as close to flawless as a man could ask for his home. The first strange event, which the goal of my narrative is to convey, occurred on the day my wife arrived. We completed dinner and were sitting in our drawing room, chatting about current events and wondering when the butler would bring us coffee. I told him we would have it immediately after dinner. She replied. I rang the bell, and he emerged nearly instantly in response. He peered around the room, surprised, as if expecting to see a third person. We will have coffee, Simpson, my wife said. Always let us have it as soon after dinner as possible. You will excuse me, madam, but I thought you were engaged with a lady. I have seen no lady. He gazed at her, perplexed. A lady came up the hall, he went on to say, just as you left the dining room, and I thought she came in here. I gave the man a hard stare. He appeared to be sober. "You must have drank it," I went on. "No, sir, I am certain I did not. I recognized her and would recognize her again anywhere. I didn't bother you because she appeared to be in a lot of trouble. I sincerely apologize, sir." He walked away to bring in the coffee. When he returned, I requested him to give me a more detailed description of the person in question. I could tell she was tall and lovely, but she had a sorrowful expression on her face. She was clothed totally in black and had a black lace shawl around her neck. The man was sincere, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. "Let us take a look around," I said. "I am quite sure that the hall door has not been opened since dinner, and if she is in the house now, we shall doubtless find her." We headed off with my wife, visiting all of the apartments on the ground floor, including the servants' hall. My wife questioned the maids, but they all claimed to have not been in the hall since dinner. We then attempted all of the rooms upstairs with the same outcome. If Simpson's mystery black lady existed, she was not in the house. I was more persuaded than ever that the man had fallen asleep in his pantry and dreamed it. But we weren't finished with her yet. A week or so later, when we were all settled in, one of the maids who had gone down to the village reported seeing a lady in great distress on a path that led through the bushes to a side gate. She was wringing her hands, according to the girl's story. The maid couldn't see her face since it was too dark. "Are you certain of what you're saying?" I inquired as Simpson brought the girl into the room. "I am certain, sir," she replied. I held the gate open for her to pass through. "Did she say anything to you?" "Not a single word, sir. She just walked right past me, as if she didn't notice me." "This is really one of the strangest things I've ever heard," I told my wife when we were alone together. "I'm curious who the woman is, and by what right does she trespass on my property? When I meet her, I'll ask her the question." Christmas was quickly approaching, and we had planned a large house party to celebrate with us. Among them was a young man named Despereaux, who had recently joined a Lancer regiment. We had put him in the bachelor's wing, which was the oldest part of the house. He and I were the first ones to enter the drawing room before supper. "I say, old man," he continued, "how many people are in your house?" I informed him. "Yes, but who is the other one?" "The lady with the sad expression, and a very pretty one at that." "There is no one else," I said. "I have given you the names of all of them." "Well, that's amusing. I promise she wasn't a maid. And I've seen your wife's maid. Are you certain you're not rotting me?" "Perfectly certain. Please describe this enigmatic individual to me." "Well, I'm not much of a hand at that sort of work, but I know she was very attractive, having what appeared to be a lace mantilla on her head, and she appeared to be in unusual distress. She was wringing her hands and staring at me with such sadness that I was almost inclined to ask her what was wrong. "Wait here for a moment," I said. "I'll run upstairs and see if I can discover who this person can be." I did so, mumbling to myself that I was sick of the lady's visits to my house. Despite searching the bachelor's wing and any other rooms I could get into, I couldn't find her. I returned to the drawing room and told Despereaux about my misfortune. "Well, you can say whatever you want," he replied. "I saw her plainly as I can see you now." As a result, the matter was put on hold for the time being. My wife was the next person to have a peek of her. It was Christmas Eve, and the ladies had gone down to the church to decorate it for the following day. It was nearly dark when they began to return. My wife stayed behind the party for approximately 10 minutes to speak with the vicar about some issues. When she left the church, it was snowing fiercely, and the countryside was indescribably beautiful in the light of the full moon. According to her account of events, she had just left the shrubbery and was walking along the path that ran at the foot of the terrace when she looked up and noticed a woman dressed in black leaning against it, looking down at her. She still claims that she was too astonished to be scared or speak, or do anything. The woman then walked away from her, wringing her hands as if in tremendous distress. I couldn't believe it had been 3 minutes since I'd been notified, and was out on the terrace in pursuit. I looked around, but there was no sign of her. And even stranger, there was no other footmark on the snow, save mine. The situation was getting out of hand. I couldn't make any sense of it. The next day, after the morning service, I approached the vicar and asked him if he could provide any insight into the enigma. I informed him that the situation was becoming more serious. The servant swore that it was a ghost and threatened to quit me as a result. Well, I will not deny, he continued, that something of this sort has been village gossip for a long time, and more than one person has claimed to have seen it. I, for one, have never done so. According to legend, it is the spirit of a Spanish woman who used to be the mistress of the house. If you come back into the church, I'll show you a tablet dedicated to her memory. I followed him till I came across the inscription in question. It defined her, for reasons already explained. I will not provide her name, as the wife of the house's owner, and also stated that she died in 1782. There's not much to be gained from that. That's what I said. But the coincidence is, to say the least of it, singular. I thanked him and rejoined my group. That evening was devoted to the traditional seasonal activities. I'm afraid we're all extremely young, and must have shocked Simpson's grave. We played dumb crambo, charades, and finally thought reading. In my turn, I exited the room while an experiment was being set up. The auditorium was well lit, and I swear to you, I had no thoughts of the strange lady at the time. I looked up to see her walking down the passage at the top of the large staircase toward the bachelor's quarters. I dashed up the steps, grabbing a hat and coat, just in time to see her rounding the bend of the passage. I began my pursuit. She was clearly on her way to a small door that led down a flight of stairs to the garden below. She had vanished by the time I arrived. But as I flung open the door, I noticed her hurrying along the garden path towards the shrubbery. I resumed my pursuit while wearing my hat and sketching on my coat. She exited the wicket gate and entered the small path that led to the tor. It was a full moon night, and it was almost as bright as day. She flew by, leaving no trace on the snow, at such a breakneck pace that I struggled to keep her in sight. She finally arrived at the tor's base and began her ascent. This was more than I had counted for, considering my feet were in evening dress shoes and the snow was inches deep on the ground. However, having come this far, I was keen to see how it all ended. I began to climb, staggering and falling, the black figure rushing ahead of me, without pausing for a moment. Finally, it arrived at the summit and stood, perhaps 20 times, atop the highest boulder. I can promise you that it produced an odd image. Then she raised her arms above her head and descended nearly 200 feet to the rocks below. On my honor, it was so real that I burst out laughing when I saw it. I scrambled down to look for her, but there was no trace of her. Her death brought the tragedy to a close. I returned home, unable to believe the evidence of my senses. I took Desborough up the tor the next day and explained the scene to him. He probably believed I was hallucinating. We stood at the bottom and looked up. By God, it'd be a horrible place to jump from, he remarked. Does that look like a cave up there? He pointed halfway up the cliff wall. There was definitely a cave there. Perhaps that is the clue to the mystery, I thought to myself. From the top, a man could be lowered to it. I'll look at it as soon as the snow melts. A week later, I returned to the tor with 6 of my guys and a strong rope. After taking every precaution, they lowered me over the cliff until I reached the cave's tight mouth. I squeezed myself in and lit a candle that I had brought with me. 3 stairs led me into a fair-sized tunnel, which revealed the strangest and most terrifying sight man has ever seen. A man's skeleton lay stretched out on the floor, surrounded by the remains of books and what appeared to be a blanket. I picked one of the volumes and found the name of the guy whose wife's tablet I had seen at the local church on Christmas Day within the cover. Later, I thoroughly studied it. I am dying of starvation, It said on the inside. They won't allow my white to bring me meals. I threw away the papers. Goodbye, my dear wife. As a result, the riddle was solved. The unfortunate remains were removed from their long resting place and properly burial. The Black Lady, as the villagers refer to her, has not been seen since. I make no attempt to account for it. I'll just tell you the story. Smee is a scary ghost story by A.M. Burrage about a group of young people who play a game of hide and seek in a haunted house where a young girl died. No, Jackson said with a mocking smirk. I'm sorry. I don't want to interfere with your game. I'm not going to do that since you'll have plenty without me. But I'm not going to play hide and seek. It was Christmas Eve, and we were a group of 14 with just the right amount of youthful leavening. We'd eaten well. It was the season for childish games, and we were all in the mood to play them except Jackson. When hide and seek was suggested, there was enthusiastic and virtually unanimous acceptance. His was the only dissenting opinion. It wasn't like Jackson to ruin a game or refuse to do what others asked. Someone asked him whether he was feeling seedy. No, he replied, I feel perfectly fit. Thank you. But he said, softening his firm refusal with a smile, not playing hide and seek. What's the harm? Somyon inquired. He paused for a moment before responding. I occasionally go and stay in a house where a girl was murdered. In the dark, she was playing hide and seek. She was unfamiliar with the house. There was a door leading to the servants' stairwell. When she was being pursued, she mistook the door for a bedroom. She flung open the door and landed at the bottom of the stairs. Of course, she cracked her neck. We all appeared solemn. How dreadful, cried Mrs. Fernley. And were you present when it occurred? Jackson sighed and shook his head. No, he said, but he was present when something else happened. Something even terrible. What could possibly be worse than that? This was, Jackson remarked. He paused for a moment before continuing. I wonder whether any of you have ever played a game called Smee. It's far superior to hide and seek. Of course, it's me inspired the name. Maybe you should play it instead of hide and seek. Allow me to teach you the game's rules. Each player receives a sheet of paper, except for one. All of the sheets are blank. Smee is written on the last sheet of paper. Nobody knows who Smee is unless Smee tells them. You turn out the lights, and Smee quietly exits the room and hides. After a while, the others set out to look for Smee, but they have no idea who they are looking for. When one player approaches another, he says Smee to challenge him. The other player responds, Smee, and they continue to look. However, when challenged, the actual Smee does not respond. The second player follows him stealthily. They will currently be detected by a third player. He will challenge and get no response. Thus, he will join the first two. This continues until all of the players are in the same location. The last person to find Smee must pay a forfeit. It's a fun, raucous, and hilarious game. It usually takes a long time for everyone to find Smee in a large house. Perhaps you'd want to give it a shot. I'll gladly pay my forfeit and sit by the fire while you play. It sounds like a fun game, I remarked. Have you tried it? Jackson. Yes, he replied. I played it in the house I mentioned to you. And she was present. The girl who shattered. No, someone else said. He said he wasn't present. When she fractured her neck. Jackson paused for a moment. I'm not sure if she was there or not. She was, I'm afraid. I know there were 13 of us playing the game, but only 12 individuals were in the house, and I had no idea what the name of the deceased girl was. It didn't bother me when I heard that mumbled name in the dark, but I tell you that I will never play that type of game again. For a long time, it made me tremendously nervous. I like to pay my forfeit all at once. You were all staring at him. His words made no sense at all. Tim Vaus was the world's kindest man. He gave us all a friendly smile. This seems like a fascinating narrative, he observed. Come on, Jackson, instead of incurring a forfeit, you can inform us. Very nicely, Jackson said. And now for his narrative. Have you encountered the Sangstons? They are my relatives, and they live in Surrey. They invited me to spend Christmas with them 5 years ago. It was an old house with numerous unnecessary passageways and staircases. A stranger could easily become lost in it. So I went down for Christmas that year. Violet Sangston assured me that I would recognize the majority of the other guests. Unfortunately, I couldn't leave work until Christmas Eve. The other visitors had all arrived the day before. I was the last one to arrive, just in time for dinner. I greeted everyone I knew, and Violet Sangston introduced me to others I didn't know. It was then time to go in for dinner. That's why I didn't recognize the name of a tall, dark-haired, attractive female I'd never met before. Everyone was rushing, and I'm always bad at remembering people's names. She appeared to be both frigid and intelligent. She didn't appear nice, but she did look interesting, and I was curious about who she was. I didn't ask since I was confident that someone would address her by name throughout the meal. Unfortunately, I was seated quite far away from her. I was sitting next to Mrs. Gorman, who was being as bright and hilarious as usual. Her discussion is usually interesting, and I completely forgot to ask the name of the dark, proud girl. We were a group of 12, including the Sangstons. We were all young, or trying to be. Jack and Violet Sangston were the parents, and Reggie, their 17-year-old son, was the youngest. It was Reggie who suggested Smee when the topic went to games. He told us the game's rules, which I've described to you. All of us were cautioned by Jack Sangston. If you're going to play games in the dark, please be aware of the rear steps on the first floor, he said. A door leads to them, and I've often considered removing it. In the dark, a visitor to the residence may believe they are entering a room. On those stairs, a woman actually broke her neck. I inquired as to how it occurred. It was around 10 years ago, before we arrived. There was a party going on, and everyone was playing hide and seek. This young lady was looking for a place to hide. She ran down the corridor as she heard someone approaching. She pushed open the door, assuming it led to a bedroom. She intended to remain in there until the seeker had left. Sadly, it was the door leading to the back staircase. She tumbled all the way to the bottom of the steps. When they picked her up, she was dead. We all agreed to exercise caution. Mrs. Gorman even cracked a small joke about living to be 90. We had never met the unfortunate girl, and we didn't want to be sad on Christmas Eve. We all started playing the game right after dinner. Reggie Sangston, a young man, went around the house turning off all the lights except those in the servants' quarters and the sitting room where we were. Then we made 12 sheets of paper. 11 of them were blank, with the word Smee scrawled on one. Reggie mixed them all together, and then we each took one. The guy who got the Smee paper had to go into hiding. When I looked at mine, it was completely blank. All of the electric lights went out a split second later. In the dim light, I heard someone gently creeping up to the door. Someone blew a whistle after a minute, and we all dashed to the door. I had no idea who Smee was. We were all dashing up and down corridors and in and out of chambers for about 5 or 10 minutes, daring each other and saying, "Smee, Smee." After a while, the commotion died down, and I assumed that Smee had been found. After a while, I noticed a group of people sitting on some narrow stairs. I challenged, but received no response. So, Smee was present. I rushed into the group. 2 more players have now arrived. Everyone was attempting to avoid finishing last. Jack Sangston finished last and received a forfeit. "I assume we're all here now, don't we?" he observed. He lit a match, looked up the stairwell, and started counting. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, he said. chuckling. That's ridiculous. There's one too many. When the first match went out, he lit another and began to count. He got as far as 12 before looking perplexed. There are 13 of us here, he explained. I haven't yet counted myself. Oh, stupidity. I burst out laughing. You most likely started with yourself and now want to count yourself twice. His son pulled out an electric torch. It cast a brighter light than the matches, and we all started counting. Of course, there were a total of 12 of us. Jack burst out laughing. Well, he admitted, I was pretty sure I counted 13 twice. Violet Sankston murmured uneasily halfway up the stairs. I had the impression that someone was sitting 2 steps above me. Captain Ransom, have you relocated? The captain replied that he had not, but I had the impression that there was someone seated between Mrs. Sankston and me. For a brief moment, there was an uneasy feeling in the air. A cold finger appeared to touch each of us. For that brief moment, we were all aware that something unusual and unpleasant had just occurred, and was likely to occur again. We laughed at ourselves, and at each other after that, and we felt normal again. There were only 12 of us, and that was the end of it. We marched back to the sitting room, still laughing, to start over. I was Smee this time. Violet Sankston spotted me while I was looking for a place to hide. That game was short-lived. The game was over when there were 12 people left. Violet was cold and wished she had her jacket. Her husband went up to their bedroom to get it. Reggie tapped me on the arm as soon as he was gone. He appeared pale and ill. Quick, I've got to talk to you, he grumbled. Something terrible has occurred. We went inside the breakfast room. What's the problem? I inquired. I'm not sure. You were Smee the last time we met, weren't you? Of course, I had no idea who Smee was. While Mother and the others rushed to the west side of the house to find you, I went east. My bedroom has a large clothes closet. It appeared to be a good hiding spot. I reasoned that Smee might be present. In the dark, I opened the door and touched someone's hand. Smee, I said quietly. There was no response. I thought I'd found Smee. I don't know why, but I got a strange, cold feeling right away. I can't put it into words, but I knew something was wrong. So I turned on my electric torch, but no one was there. Now I'm certain I touched a hand. Nobody could come out of the cupboard because I was blocking the doorway. What are your thoughts? You pretended to touch a hand, I observed. He let out a quick laugh. I knew you'd say that, he admitted. Of course, it was a dream. Isn't that the only explanation? I concurred with him. I could tell he was still shaken. We returned to the sitting room for another round of Smee. The others were all eager to get back to work. Perhaps it was just my imagination, though I'm almost certain it wasn't. But I had the impression that no one was really enjoying the game any longer. But everyone was too polite to bring it up. Nonetheless, I had the impression that something was wrong. The game had lost all of its appeal. Something deep within me was warning me. Take care, it murmured. Take care, I say. In the house, there was an unnatural, toxic influence at work. Why did I have this sensation? Because Jack Sankston counted 13 people rather than 12. Because his child thought he touched someone's hand in an empty cupboard. I tried unsuccessfully to make myself laugh. So we started over. We were all as boisterous as ever, while chasing the unknown, Smee. However, it appeared to me that the majority of us were merely acting. We were no longer having fun with the game. I initially stayed with the others. However, no Smee was found for several minutes. I separated from the main group and began searching on the first floor near the west side of the house. And there, as I was feeling my way along, I came across a pair of human knees. I extended my hand and touched a thick, plush curtain. Then I realized where I was. At the end of the passage, there were large, deep windows with window seats. The curtains reached all the way to the ground. Someone was sitting in a window seat's corner, behind a curtain. Aha! I've got Smee, I thought. So I pushed the curtain aside and touched a woman's arm. Outside, it was a dark, moonless night. I couldn't see the woman sitting in the window seat's corner. Smee, I said quietly. There was no response. When Smee is questioned, he or she does not respond. So I took a seat next to her to wait for the others. Then I asked, "What's your name?" "Brenda Ford." A whisper came from the darkness beside me. I didn't know her name, but I knew who she was right away. Except for one, I knew every girl in the house, by name. And she was tall, pale, and dark. So there she was, next to me on the window seat, trapped between a heavy curtain and a window. I was getting into the game. I wondered if she was having fun as well. I muttered a couple of fairly common questions to her and received no response. Smee is a quiet game. It is a game rule that Smee and the person or people who have discovered Smee remain silent. This, of course, makes it more difficult for others to find them. But no one else was around, so I was perplexed as to why she insisted on silence. I spoke again and received no response. I started to get irritated. Perhaps she's one of those frigid, intelligent females who has a negative attitude toward all men, I reasoned. She doesn't like me, and she's using the rules of the game to avoid communication. I certainly don't want to sit with her if she doesn't enjoy sitting here with me. I moved my gaze away from her. I'm hoping someone finds us soon, I reasoned. As I sat there, I realized how much I disliked sitting next to this girl. That was strange. The girl I saw at supper seemed nice in a cold sort of way. I was intrigued by her and wanted to learn more about her. But I suddenly felt very uneasy alongside her. The sense that something was wrong, that something was out of place, was growing. I shook with fear as I remembered caressing her arm. I wanted to jump up and leave. I wished someone else would appear soon. I was about to leave when I heard faint footsteps in the corridor. Someone on the other side of the curtain, pressed up against my knees. A woman's hand brushed against my shoulder as the curtain shifted to one side. "Smee," muttered a voice I immediately recognized. Mrs. Gorman answered the phone. Of course, she received no response. She arrived and sat beside me, and I immediately felt much better. "Isn't that Tony Jackson?" she said quietly. "Yes," I said back. "Are you Smee or not?" "No, she's on my other side," she says. She leaned against me. Her fingernails scratched a woman's silk dress. "Hello, Smee. How are you doing? What is your name? Is it against the rules to speak?" "Don't worry. Tony will break the rules. This game is starting to irritate me a little, Tony. I'm hoping they don't play it all evening. I'd like to watch a lovely, peaceful game with everyone gathered around a warm fire." "Me too," I said. "Can't you offer them something? This particular game has a really sick vibe to it. I'm sure I'm being ridiculous, but I can't shake the feeling that we have an extra player, someone who shouldn't be here at all." That's exactly how I felt, but I didn't say anything. However, I felt a lot better. Mrs. Gorman's arrival had allayed my fears. We sat and talked. "I'm curious when the others will find us," Mrs. Gorman stated. After a while, we heard footsteps and young Reggie's voice saying, "Hello, hello. Is anyone present?" Yes," I replied. "Does Mrs. Gorman accompany you?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what happened to you? You both have forfeits. We've all been expecting you for hours." "But you haven't found Smee yet," I grumbled. "You don't mean you haven't. Smee was my name this time. But Smee has joined us." I sobbed. "Yes," Mrs. Gorman agreed. We sat looking into the eye of Reggie's electric flame as the curtain was drawn back. I looked at Mrs. Gorman, then at my opposite side. There was an empty space on the window seat between me and the wall. I immediately stood up. Then I sat down once more. I was feeling extremely ill. and the world seemed to spin in circles around me. Someone was there, I insisted, because I touched her. So did I, Mrs. Gorman replied, her voice trembling. And I doubt anyone could leave this window seat without our knowledge. Reggie laughed a shaky little laugh. I remembered his ordeal from earlier that evening. Someone has been making fun of me, he added. Are you going to come down? When we arrived in the sitting room, we were not well received. I discovered the two of them seated behind a curtain, on a window seat, Reggie explained. I approached the tall, dark female. You pretended to be Smee, and then left. I charged her. She made a shaky motion with her head. After that, we all played cards in the sitting room, which made me very happy. Jack Sangston wanted to speak with me later. I could tell he was annoyed with me, and he quickly explained why. I guess you're in love with Mrs. Gorman, Tony, he replied. That's your prerogative, but please don't make love to her during a game in my house. You made everyone wait. It was very mean of you, and I'm ashamed of you. However, we were not alone, I protested. There was someone else there, someone pretending to be Smee. Miss Ford, I believe you were the tall, dark girl. She addressed me in hushed tones. Of course, she later refused to accept it. Miss who? Said Jack Sangston, looking at me. He took a deep breath. Brenda Ford, she explained. Jack rested his hand on my shoulder. Look here, Tony, he went on. I don't mind a joke, but enough is enough. We don't want to frighten the ladies. Brenda Ford is the name of the girl who fell down the stairs and broke her neck. She was hiding and seeking here 10 years ago. Tarnlim is a classic horror story by Ho Walpole. It's about a boy who is plagued by a strange, supernatural dog that follows him wherever he goes. I believe, a peculiar youngster at the time. Peculiar not only by nature, but also because I had spent so much of my childhood in the company of individuals considerably older than myself. After the incidents that I will now describe, I was left with an indelible mark. I became, and have always been, one of those otherwise minor people who have made decisions concerning some issues that cannot be changed. Some things, which the majority of the world doubts, are true and unarguable for these people. This confidence gives them a type of imprint, as if they lived so much in their imagination that they have little conviction as to what is fact and what fiction. Their oddness distinguishes them. If at the age of 50, I am a man with few acquaintances, if not completely alone, it is because my Uncle Robert died in an unusual manner 40 years ago, and I was a witness to his death. I have never given any description of the extraordinary events that transpired at Faildyke Hall on the evening of Christmas Eve, 1890, until now. The events of that evening are still vividly remembered by one or two persons, and a type of legend surrounding my Uncle Robert's death has been passed down to the younger generation. But no one else was there to witness them as I was, and I believe it is time I put them down on writing. I record them without comment. I exaggerate nothing and conceal nothing. I am not, I hope, a vengeful man, but my brief contact with my Uncle Robert and the circumstances of his death gave my life a twist that was difficult for me to forgive even at that young age. Everyone must make their own judgment about the so-called supernatural element in my novel. Depending on our personalities, we either mock or accept. If we are made of a specific solid practical material, no proof, no matter how definite or firsthand, will persuade us. If dreams are our daily bread, one dream will hardly disrupt our sense of reality. But back to my story. My father and mother were in India from the age of 8 to 13. Except on 2 instances when they visited England, I never saw them. I was an only kid who was adored by both of my parents, who adored each other much more. They were a sentimental pair in the old-fashioned sense. My father was an Indian. civil service officer who also wrote poems, Tantalus. A poem in 4 cantos was even published at his own expense. This, combined with the fact that my mother had been deemed an invalid before he married her, led my parents to believe that they bore a striking similarity to the Brownings, and my father even had a pet name for my mother that sounded strangely similar to the renowned and dreadful Vi. I was a sensitive child who was sent to Mr. Ferguson's private academy at the age of 8 and spent my holidays as an unwelcome guest of various relatives. Unwanted, I suppose, since I was a tough youngster to understand. I had an elderly grandmother in Folkestone, 2 aunts who shared a little house in Kensington, an aunt, uncle, and a slew of cousins in Cheltenham, and 2 uncles in Cumberland. Except for the 2 uncles, all of these relatives had their fair share of me, and I had no special feelings for any of them. Children were not as well educated back then as they are now. I was thin, pale, and bespectacled, yearning for affection but unsure how to obtain it. Outwardly unassuming but inwardly emotional and sensitive, playing games poorly due to my poor vision, reading far more than was good for me, and telling myself stories all day and part of every night. My relatives, I believe, became bored of me in turn, and it was finally determined that my uncles in Cumberland would have to chip in. These were my father's brothers, the eldest of a large family of which he was the youngest member. My uncle Robert was approaching 70, while my uncle Constance was only 5 years younger. I always thought Constance was a strange name for a man. My uncle Robert was the proprietor of Faildyke Hall, a country home located between Wastwater Lake and the seaside town of Seascale. Uncle Constance had been living with Uncle Robert for a long time. After some family correspondence, it was determined that I would spend Christmas this year, 1890, at Faildyke Hall. I was 11 years old at the time, lean and skinny, with a protruding brow, thick spectacles, and a frightened, bashful demeanor. I remember setting out on new adventures with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. Maybe this time the miracle would happen. I'd find a buddy or a fortune, wrap myself in glory, in an unexpected way, and become the hero I'd always wanted to be. I was relieved that I wouldn't be spending Christmas with any of my other relatives, especially my cousins in Cheltenham, who mocked and tormented me and were never without ear-splitting noises. What I want most in life was the freedom to read in solitude. I was aware of a magnificent library at Faildyke. My aunt noticed me getting on the train. My uncle had given me one of Harrison Ainsworth's most horrific romances, The Lancashire Witches, and I had 5 bars of chocolate cream. So the journey was as gloriously pleasant as any experience could be to me at the time. I was allowed to read in solitude, and I had little else to ask of life at the time. Nonetheless, as the train huffed its way north, this strange land began to dominate my thoughts. I had never traveled to the north of England before, and I was unprepared for the sensation of space and freshness that I felt. The naked, unsystematic hills, the freshness of the wind on which the birds seemed to swoop with delight, the stone walls that ran like gray ribbons around the moors, and, above all, the vast expanse of sky upon whose surface clouds swam, raced, eddied, and extended in ways I had never seen before. I sat at my carriage window, lost and immersed, and when, long after dark had set, I heard "Seascale" shouted by the porter, I was still staring in a love dream. My first true introduction to the North Country was complete when I walked out onto the short, narrow platform and was greeted by the salty tang of the sea wind. I'm writing now in another area of Cumberland country, and beyond my window the line of the fell runs strong and bare against the sky, while below it the lake lies, a shard of glittering glass at Skiddaw's foot. It's possible that my feeling of this country's deep mystery stems from the bizarre story I'm now telling. But perhaps not, because I believe that first evening arrival at Seascale influenced me in such a way that none of the world's beauties, from the crimson waters of Kashmir to the rough glories of our own Cornish coast, can compete for my attention with the sharp, peaty winds and strong, resilient turf of the Cumberland Hills. That evening's pony trap ride to Faildyke was wonderful. It was very cold outside, but I didn't seem to mind. To me, everything seemed amazing. I could see Black Comb's enormous sluggish hump jet against the frothy clouds of the winter night from the start, and I could hear the sea breaking and the quiet rustle of the dry branches in the hedgerows. That night, I also made a lifelong friend in Bob Armstrong, who was driving the trap. He has frequently told me since, despite being a slow man of few words, he likes to repeat things that seem worthwhile to him, that I struck him as pitifully lost that evening on the Seascale platform. I appeared, without a doubt, pinched and frigid. In any event, it was a fortunate appearance for me because I immediately gained Armstrong's heart, and once he gave it, he could never bear to take it back. On his side, he appeared enormous to me that night. He possessed, I believe, one of the world's largest chests, which he described as a misfortune because no ready-made clothes would ever fit him. Because of the cold, I sat close to him. He was very warm, and I could feel his heart beating like a steady clock. Inside his rough coat, it beat for me that night, and it's been beating for me ever since. In reality, as it turned out, I needed a friend. I was almost asleep and rigid all over my little body when I was dragged from the trap, and immediately led into what appeared to be an enormous hall crammed with the glaring heads of killed animals and smelling of straw. My uncles appeared to be double to me when I saw them in a big billiard room where a great fire blazed in a stone chimney like a devil. In any case, they were a strange couple. My Uncle Robert was a small man with unruly gray hair and small, keen eyes framed by two of humanity's bushiest brows. He was dressed in shabby country clothes of a faded green color, and he wore a ring with a thick red stone on one finger, which I recall as if it were yesterday. Another thing I noticed right away when he kissed me, I loathed being kissed by anyone, was a slight aroma he had, which I immediately associated with the caraway seeds in seed cake. I also saw that his teeth were discolored and yellow. I liked my Uncle Constance right away. He was round, fat, affable, and clean. Uncle Constance was a real gentleman. In contrast to his sibling, he had a flower in his buttonhole, and his linen was spotless white. But I saw one thing at that initial meeting. Before he talked to me and put his large arm around my shoulder, he seemed to look towards his brother, as if seeking permission. You could argue that it was odd for a youngster my age to notice so much, but at the time, I noticed everything. Years and idleness. Oh dear, I've become lax in my observation. That night, I had a dreadful dream that woke me up screaming and brought Bob Armstrong in to calm me down. My room, like all the others I'd seen, was huge and vacant, with a large stretch of floor and a stone fireplace similar to the one in the billiard room. It was, I later discovered, next to the servants' quarters. Armstrong's room was just next to mine, and Mrs. Spender's, the housekeeper's, was just beyond. Armstrong was and still is a bachelor. He used to tell me that he loved so many women that he couldn't bring himself to choose just one. And now he's been my personal bodyguard for too long and is too accustomed to my ways to change his state. Furthermore, he is 70 years old. This is what I observed in my dream. They had started a fire for me, which was required because the room was extremely cold, and I dreamed that I awoke to see the flames climb to their final vigor before dying away. In the glare of that light, I became aware that something was moving in the room. I heard the movement for a few moments before I saw anything. I sat up, my heart pounding, and then, to my horror, I noticed the ugliest-looking yellow mongrel of a dog slinking against the far wall. It's impossible for me, and it's always been difficult for me, to express the horror of that yellow dog. It was partially due to its foul color, partly due to its mean and bony physique, but mostly due to its horrible head flat, with sharp small eyes and jagged yellow fangs. When I glanced at it, it bared those teeth at me and then proceeded to creep in the direction of my bed in an indescribably disgusting manner. I tensed with fear at first. I screamed again and again as it approached the bed, its small eyes fixated on me and its teeth bared. Armstrong was sitting on my bed, his muscular arm around my shaking tiny body. The next thing I knew, all I could think about was the dog, the canine, the canine. He comforted me as if he were my mother. There's no dog there. There is no one else but myself. There is no one else but myself. I continued to shake, so he went into bed with me, held me close to him, and I fell asleep in his loving arms. I awoke to a cool breeze, a bright sun, and orange, red, and dun chrysanthemums blowing against the gray stone wall beyond the sloping meadows. As a result, I forgot about my dream. I only knew that I adored Bob Armstrong more than anyone else on the planet. Everyone was really nice to me during the next few days. I was so taken by this new place that I couldn't think of anything else at first. Bob Armstrong was Cumbrian from the top of his flaxen head to the big nails under his boots, and he gave me the color of the ground in grunts and monosyllables, as was his wont. Smugglers sneaking in and out of Drake and Seascale, the ancient cross in Gosworth graveyard, Ravenglass, with all its seabirds, once a thriving port, Muncaster Castle and Broughton, and Black Wastwater with the grim screes, Black Combe, whose broad back the shadows were always dancing, even the little station at Seascale, naked to the sea winds, whose bookstalls I bought a publication called The Weekly Telegraph, which contained installments of the most thrilling story in the world, week by week. The cows moving along the sandy lanes, the sea thundering along Drigg Beach, Gable, and Scafell, pulling their cloud caps around their heads, the slow voices of Cumbrian farmers calling their animals, the little tinkling bell of the Gosworth church everywhere romance and beauty. But as I became more acquainted with the countryside, the people around me began to attract my attention and pique my restless interest, particularly my two uncles. They were, indeed, odd enough. Faildyke Hall was not strange, but it was quite ugly. It was probably built around 1830, a square white edifice, like a thick-set, very pompous woman with a rather plain face. The rooms were enormous, the hallways were many, and everything was plastered in a terrible whitewash. Against the whitewash were hung yellowed with age pictures and faded poor watercolors. The furniture was both sturdy and unsightly. But there was one beautiful feature, the small gray tower where my Uncle Robert lived. This tower stood at the far end of the garden, overlooking a sloping meadow and the Scafell Massif beyond Wastwater. It was constructed hundreds of years ago to defend against the Scots. Robert had kept his study and bedroom there for many years, and it was his domain. No one was permitted to enter except his old servant Hucking, a bent, wizened, grimy little man who spoke to no one, and, according to the kitchen gossip, managed to go through life without sleeping. He was in charge of my Uncle Robert, cleaning his rooms and washing his clothes. As an inquisitive and romantically inclined young guy, I became as enthralled by this tower as Bluebeard's wife was by the forbidden room. Bob instructed me that no matter what I did, I was not to set foot inside. And then I discovered something else. Bob Armstrong despised, feared, and admired my Uncle Robert. He was proud of him because he was the head of the family, and according to him, the wisest old guy in the world. There's nothing he can't appear to do, Bob added, but he doesn't like you watching him do it. All of this further fueled my desire to see the inside of the tower, despite the fact that I wasn't very fond of my Uncle Robert. It's difficult to say I despised him in those early days. When he first met me, he was fairly kind. And at mealtimes, when I sat with my two uncles at the long table in the vast, stark, whitewashed dining room, he was always concerned that I had enough to eat. But I never liked him, possibly because he wasn't clean. Children are especially sensitive to such things. Perhaps I didn't enjoy the fusty, seedy odor he carried around with him. Then there was the time he invited me into the gray tower and told me all about Tarnhelm. Pale, slanting shadows of sunlight fell on the chrysanthemums and gray stone walls, as well as the long fields and dusky hills. I was playing by the little creek that ran beyond the rose garden by myself when Uncle Robert crept up behind me in his soundless way and, tweaking me by the ear, asking if I wanted to come inside his tower with him. I was excited, but I was also terrified, especially when I saw Hucking's moth-eaten old countenance gazing at us through one of the thin slits that appeared to be windows. But we went in, my hand in Uncle Robert's hot, dry one. There wasn't, in reality, so very much to see when you were inside, all untidy and musty, with cobwebs over the doorways and old pieces of rusty iron, and empty boxes in the corners, and the long table in Uncle Robert's study covered with 1,000 things books with the covers hanging on them, sticky green bottles, a looking glass, a pair of scales, a globe, a cage with mice in it, a statue of a naked woman, an hourglass, everything old and stained and dusty. Uncle Robert, on the other hand, insisted me sit close to him and told me many interesting stories. Among these is the Tarnhelm story. Tarnhelm was something you put on your head, and its enchantment transformed you into any animal you choose. Uncle Robert told me about Woden, a god who mocked the dwarf who controlled Tarnhelm by saying he couldn't convert himself into a mouse or some such animal, and the dwarf, his pride wounded, turned himself into a mouse, which the god easily captured and thus stole Tarnhelm. Among the debris on the table was a gray skull cap. That's my Tarnhelm. Uncle Robert chuckled. Would you like to see me put it on? But I was instantly terrified, horribly terrified. I was sickened by the sight of Uncle Robert. The room began to spin in circles. The cage's white mice twittered. That room was stuffy enough to make any boy sick. That was the moment, I believe, when Uncle Robert extended his hand towards his gray skullcap. After that, I was never happy in Faildyke Hall again. That simple and seemingly nice deed of his seemed to open my eyes to a number of things. We were now 10 days away from Christmas. The prospect of Christmas had, and, to be honest, still has, a very joyful effect on me. There's the lovely story, the geniality and kindness, and despite modern pessimists, a lot of happiness and friendliness. Even now, I adore giving and receiving gifts. The sight of the parcel, the paper, the string, the wonderful surprise, was a pleasure to me. As a result, I had been looking forward to Christmas with bated breath. I'd been promised a trip to Whitehaven to buy presents, as well as a tree and a dance for the Gosworth locals. Then, following my visit to Uncle Robert's tower, all my excitement faded. As the days passed and my observations of one thing after another grew, I believe I would have fled back to my aunt's in Kensington if it hadn't been for Bob Armstrong. Armstrong, in fact, was the one who started me on that trip of observation that ended so badly, because when he found out Uncle Robert had taken me inside his tower, he was furious. I'd never seen him angry before. Suddenly his huge bulk shook, and he gripped and held me till I yelled out. He wanted me to swear I'd never go inside there again. What? Even not with Uncle Robert? No, not with Uncle Robert. And then, dropping his voice and looking about to make sure no one was listening, he began to curse Uncle Robert. This astounded me because one of Bob's great laws was devotion to his masters. I can see us now, standing on the stable cobbles in the falling white dusk, watching the horses stampede in their stalls, and the little sharp stars sparkling between the driving clouds. I'm not going to remain, he said to himself. I'll be like everyone else. I'm not going to stay, to include a youngster in it. He appeared to have me under his unique command from that point on. Even when I couldn't see him, I had the impression that his benevolent eye was on me, and this sensation of the need to be cautious made me feel even more anxious and concerned. The next thing I noticed was that the maids were all new, having just been there for a month or two. The housekeeper then left just a week before Christmas. Uncle Constance appeared agitated by these events, whilst Uncle Robert appeared unconcerned. I've arrived to my Uncle Constance's house. It's strange how clearly I can see him now. His stoutness, his dazzling cleanliness, his dandyism, the flower in his buttonhole, his little brightly shod feet, his thin, somewhat feminine voice. He would have been nice to me if he had dared. But something stopped him, and I soon realized what that something was: terror of my Uncle Robert. It didn't take me long to figure out that he was completely dependent on his brother. He said nothing without first checking to see how Uncle Robert received it, proposed no strategy until he had assurance from his brother, and was afraid beyond anything I had ever seen in a human being at the slightest show of dissatisfaction in my uncle. After that, I realized that Uncle Robert relished exploiting his brother's concerns. I didn't know enough about their lives to know what weapons Robert used, but I was neither too young nor too naive to see that they were sharp and piercing. That was our position a week before Christmas. The weather had turned wild, with a strong wind. Nature seems to be in a frenzy. When I lay in my bed at night and heard shouting in my chimney, I imagined I could hear the crash of the waves on the beach and see the black waters of Wastwater cream and curdle beneath the screes. I'd lie awake at night longing for Bob Armstrong, the strength of his arm and the warmth of his breast. But I considered myself too mature a young man to make such an appeal. My anxieties were increasing virtually minute by minute, I recall. Who knows what gave them their strength and might? The weather was wild. The rooms of the house were large and desolate. The servants, mysterious. The walls of the passages lit always with an unnatural glimmer because of their white color. And although Armstrong kept watch over me, he was busy with his affairs and could not always be with me. I was increasingly afraid of and disliked my Uncle Robert. Hatred and dread seemed to be everywhere, but he was always soft-spoken and polite. Then, a few days before Christmas, the incident that would turn my anxiety into panic occurred. I'd been reading Mrs. Radcliffe's Romance of the Forest in the library, an ancient classic long forgotten, but deserving of revival. The library was a lovely space, with bookcases from floor to ceiling, small and dark windows, and holes in the ancient faded carpet. A lamp burned on a nearby table. One was on a small shelf by my side. Something compelled me to search it up. What I observed back then has left an imprint on my heart. A yellow dog stood at the library door, motionless, peering across the room at me. I won't try to express the wretched fear and wild frozen panic that gripped and held me. My main idea, I believe, was that the other vision I experienced on my first night, there had not been a dream. I wasn't sleeping anymore. The book I was reading had dropped to the floor, the lamps had dimmed, and I could hear the ivy tapping on the window pane. This was fact, not fantasy. The dog scratched itself with a long, ugly leg. Then it moved slowly and softly over the carpet towards me. I couldn't yell. I couldn't move, so I just waited. With its flat head, tiny eyes, and yellow teeth, the animal appeared much more wicked than before. It moved gradually toward me, stopped once to itch itself, and was almost at my chair. It glanced at me, bared its teeth, but now with a smile, and then passed by. After it was gone, there remained a thick, foetid aroma in the air, caraway seed scent. Looking back, I think it was astonishing that I, a pale, frightened boy who shivered at every sound, should have handled the situation the way I did. I never mentioned the dog to a living soul, not even Bob Armstrong. I hid my fears, and they were monstrous and horrible fears, within my breast. I had the wisdom to perceive, and I'm not sure how I caught the consciousness of this in the air at this distance, that I was playing my small part in the culmination of something that had been building for months, like the clouds above Gable. Understand that I offer no explanation from beginning to end. There is possibly, and I'm still not sure, nothing to explain. My Uncle Robert died simply, but you will hear about it. What was beyond doubt was that it was after I saw the dog in the library that Uncle Robert changed his behavior toward me in such an unusual way. That could have been a mere coincidence. I only know that, as one gets older, things become less and less coincidental. In any event, Uncle Robert appeared to be 20 years older that night during supper. He was bent and shriveled, refused to eat, growled at everybody who spoke to him, and avoided even looking at me. It was a difficult supper, and the most astonishing thing happened after it, when Uncle Constance and I were sitting alone in the old yellow papered drawing room, a room with two ticking clocks that were always racing against each other. Uncle Constance and I were having a game of draughts. The only sounds were the wind howling down the chimney, the hissing and sputtering of the fire, and the ridiculous ticking of the clocks. Uncle Constance abruptly dropped the piece he was about to move and began to cry. To a child, seeing an adult cry is always upsetting, and to this day, hearing a male cry is really unsettling. To me, I was deeply moved by poor Uncle Constance, who sat there with his head in his white plump hands, his entire big body shivering. I raced over to him, and he grasped and hugged me as if he'd never let me go. He sobbed unintelligibly about protecting and caring for me, observing that creature. I recall trembling as soon as I heard the term. I asked my uncle what monster he was talking about, but he could only babble incoherently about hatred and not having the courage, and if only he had the courage. After a few period of recovery, he began to question me. What had I been doing? Had I visited his brother's tower? Was there anything that scared me? Would I immediately inform him if I did? And then, he whispered that he would never have let me come if he had realized how far it would go, that it would be better if I left that night, and that if he wasn't terrified. Then he trembled again and looked at the door, and I trembled as well. He held me in his arms. Suddenly we heard a sound and listened, our heads up, our two hearts pounding. But it was only the clocks ticking, and the wind wailing as if it was going to tear the house apart. However, when Bob Armstrong came up to bed that night, he discovered me hiding there. I told him I was scared, wrapped my arms around his neck, and begged him not to send me away. He promised me not to leave him, and I slept all night under the security of his power. But how can I accurately portray the terror that now stalks me? Because I knew from what Armstrong and Uncle Constance had said that there was actual danger, that it wasn't a frenzied fantasy or an ill-digested dream of mine. It made matters worse that Uncle Robert had vanished. He was ill, so he remained in his tower, attended to by his elderly wise manservant. As a result of being nowhere, he was everywhere. I stayed near Armstrong when I could, but pride kept me from clinging to his coat like a girl. A deathly hush descended over the scene. No one laughed or sang, and no dog or bird sang. An iron cold descended on the land 2 days before Christmas. The fields were rigid, the sky appeared to be frozen gray, and scafell and gable were dark under the olive cloud. Christmas Eve arrived. On that morning, I was trying to draw a juvenile painting of one of Mrs. Ratcliffe's sceneries when the double doors opened and Uncle Robert appeared. He stood there, hunched and shriveled, his long gray locks falling over his collar and his bushy brows pulled forward. He was dressed in an old green suit, and his huge red ring shone on his finger. Of course, I was terrified, but I was also moved by sympathy. In this big vacant house, he appeared old, fragile, and little. I jumped to my feet. "Are you better, Uncle Robert?" I said timidly. He bowed even lower, almost to his hands and feet, then stared up at me, his yellow fangs bared, almost like an animal growl. The doors then closed again. Finally, the slow, sneaky, gloomy afternoon arrived. Armstrong and I walked to Gosworth Village for some business. We didn't say anything at the hall. I told him, as he had reminded me, how fond I was of him, and how I wished to be with him all the time, and he replied that perhaps it might be so, not knowing how right that prophecy would prove to be. I, like many children, had a great capacity for forgetting the environment I was not in at the time, and I strolled behind Bob down the cold roads, part of my concerns, surrendering. But only for a short time. When I entered the spacious, golden drawing room, it was gloomy. As I walked out of the anteroom, I could hear the bells of Cosworth Church ringing. A sharp, scared cry followed a moment later. Who's that? What is its identity? Uncle Constance stood in front of the yellow silk window drapes, peering out at the dusk. I approached him, and he drew me close to him. "Listen," he said quietly. "Can you hear anything?" The double doors that I had entered were only halfway open. At first, I could only hear the clocks and the faint rumble of a cart on the icy road. There was no breeze. My uncle's fingers pressed against my shoulder. "Listen," he said it again. And now I know. The patter of an animal's feet could be heard on the stone passage beyond the drawing room. Uncle Constance and I exchanged glances. We admitted in that exchanged glance that our secret was the same. We knew what we needed to see. It appeared a second later, standing in the double doorway, crouching slightly and glaring at us with a terrible and sick hatred, the hatred of a sick beast, insane with anguish, but loathing us more than its own agony. Slowly, it approached us, and the entire room appeared to smell of caraway seed. "Hold back. Keep your distance," my uncle yelled. In my turn, I became the protector. "It will not touch you. It will not harm you." "Uncle," I dialed. But then the animal appeared. It lingered for a moment near a small round table with a composition of dead waxen fruit under a glass dome. It remained here, nose down, smelling the earth. Then, as we looked up, it started up again. Oh God! Even after all these years, the flat skull, the cringing body in its terrible color, and that repulsive stench are still with me. It slobbered at its jaw a little. It exposed its fangs. Then I shrieked, hid my face in my uncle's breast, and saw that he was holding a large, hefty, old-fashioned pistol in his shaky hand. "Go back, Robert," he yelled. "Come back." The beast appeared. He opened fire. The explosion shook the entire room. The dog turned and crept across the floor, blood trickling from its throat. It came to a halt near the door, turned, and gazed at us. It then vanished into the other room. My uncle had thrown down his gun. He was crying and sniffling, rubbing my brow and whispering platitudes. Finally, clutching to one another, we followed the blood. Splotches across the carpet, beside the door, and through the entryway. My Uncle Robert, wounded in the throat, was huddled against a chair in the outside sitting room, one leg curled under him. A gray skull cap lay at his side on the floor. The Bloody Axe is a scary story about a young boy who suspects his father may be a murderer. It is based on an old horror comic that is considered one of the scariest comics ever made. I recall that Christmas when I was 8 years old, as if it had happened yesterday. I remember how I would lie quite motionless under the old moth-eaten quilt my mother made. I was wide awake and listened for those familiar sounds. The thump of the front door closing. The clomp, clomp, clomp of my father's mud-caked boots on the stairs. The sound that to this day still fills me with repulsion and horror. Drip. Then my father would pass by my doorway, and the light from the hallway would cast his shadow on my bedroom wall, and the shadow of the bloodied axe he carried in his hands. The next morning, I would eat my watery oatmeal in the icy coolness of our kitchen and ask my mother, very slowly and deliberately, where was Daddy last night? She would only look at me with her sorrowful, gray eyes. I will never forget the sorrow and torment in those eyes, but she never said a word. After breakfast, I would start about completing the chores on our little farm. My father never performed much work on the farm. He always looked to be busy with other tasks. On those cool, windy mornings when the snow began to fall, I had a lot of time to think. At school, I couldn't pay much attention to my lessons. I was often lost in my own troublesome thoughts. When I returned home in the evening, I would arrive just in time to see my father departing, his axe clasped securely in his hands. I rarely saw my father during daylight hours and at night. All I ever saw was his shadow. I can still vividly recall that dreadful night when I was awakened by the sound of the shutters on my bedroom window clattering in the roaring December winds. When I stood up to close the shutters, I happened to peek over toward the barn and observed a shadow in the darkness. It was my father, and he was putting something into the feed box we used for the livestock. I returned to bed and remained awake long into the night, perplexed by just what I had seen. Eventually, I slipped into a tormented and uneasy slumber. The next day, my curiosity got the better of me. I took the key that hung on a hook in the kitchen and opened the feed box. I recall standing and staring for many seconds at the foul-smelling, bloody pulp inside, trying to understand why my father wolf put chunks of a dead animal into the feed box. Then I discovered something that struck fear into the depths of my soul. Justing up out of the gory, awful was a severed human hand. From that moment, I was overwhelmed with a terrible fear. I no longer looked at my parents with trust, but with a dark, creeping distrust. I began to notice things that had previously escaped my attention. Newspaper headlines that spoke about gruesome killings and uncovered bodies. Overheard conversations about a bloodthirsty demon on the prowl. I heard a boy at school utter 2 words that reverberated over and over in my troubled mind. That night, my slumber was plagued by shapeless monsters. In these nightmares, I saw 2 pictures that tormented me constantly. The visage of my father and an axe dripping with blood. Unable to sleep, I got out of bed and crept downstairs. Taking my father's axe from the fireplace, I dimmed the lights and crouched in the darkness at the top of the steps. It seemed an eternity until I heard the key in the lock and the front door swing open, then close. Thump! I listened for those familiar footsteps on the stairs. Clomp! 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 Stepping out of the darkness, I raised the axe above my head and brought it crashing down. In the strange calm that followed, I listened for the sound of any movement from my parents' bedroom. I hoped against hope that my mother had heard nothing. The only thing I heard was the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet and the hammering of my heart. I stared for the last time at the decapitated body that lay crumpled at the bottom of the steps, then softly tiptoed back to my bed. Early the next morning, I was awakened by the sound of unusual voices in our hallway. Silently, I crept to the top of the stairs and glanced down at the sight below. A handful of officers were huddled around my father's bloody corpse. My mother was standing alongside them, watching silently. No one was paying any attention, but when she glanced up, she noticed me. Then, very briefly, very discreetly, The Carol Singers is a scary story for Christmas about a kid whose father and grandfather go from door to door, begging for money. It is based on an old horror story by Bernard Capes called The Vanishing House. My grandfather was an alcoholic, and my father was a drunk, but I never touched a drop. There's a reason behind that. When I was young, times were rough, and I grew up impoverished. My grandfather and my father never done an honest day's labor in their lives. Granddad wasn't good for much, but he played the clarinet like an artist. He taught my father how to play the accordion. Every Christmas, they would collect a bunch of their friends and go from door to door, playing Christmas music, singing Christmas carols, and begging for money. Afterwards, they would all head down to the pub and spend it on alcohol. One Christmas Eve, they brought me with them. I was too young to play an instrument, so they handed me a triangle and ordered me to strike it every now and again. The night was dark, the snow was falling, and a chilly December wind slashed through us like a dagger. We kept our heads down and walked through the snow in the storm. Eventually, my grandfather stopped and stated, This looks like as good a place as any. We were outside a magnificent mansion, decked with Christmas lights. My granddad knocked on the front door, and we began to play some old Christmas tunes. The door of the house swung open, and in the dim light, I saw a young woman standing there. She was holding a tray of glasses in her hands. With a smile, she took up a glass and held it out, encouraging one of the males to sip. My grandfather rubbed his hands together with glee and accepted the glass. Just then, I looked up, and in the window above, I saw a face peeping out of the darkness, a face that was terrible beyond words. I looked back at the woman in the doorway, and her face was awful too. Before I could stop him, my grandfather lifted the glass to his lips and knocked it back with one large sip. "Oh dear," exclaimed the woman, in an uncanny little voice. "You've drunk blood, sir." With that, the door slammed shut. My grandfather lurched backwards and the glass spilled from his hands. It cracked with a tremendous crash and he sank in the snow. I don't remember much after that. All I recall is waking up in the brightness of dawn and finding myself lying in the snow. The other men were lying all around me, just waking up themselves. My father climbed to his feet and rubbed his head. The woman had disappeared and the house was boarded up and abandoned. All that was left was a huge red stain in the exhibit where the glass had broken. My grandfather lay there in the snow alongside it, his face all purple and swollen. He was as dead as a doornail. We hurried home that morning and contacted the police. They took up my grandfather's body and carried it to the mortuary. My father told them what had happened, but they didn't believe a word of his tale. They reported the house had been vacant for over 100 years. After that night, my father was never the same guy again. He never let another drop of alcohol touch his lips and made sure I did the same. Girls' Night Out is a scary story about two teenage girls named Isobella and Chloe who are stalked by a dangerous murderer. Both Isobella and Chloe were typical examples of teenage girls in the United States. The entire time that they were together after school consisted of activities like as viewing scary movies, having sleepovers, and going shopping for new clothes. They liked partying, keeping up with their buddies, having fun and generally enjoying life. There was no way for them to know the terrible destiny that life had in store for them before it happened. On a certain evening, Isobella and Chloe made the decision to go out for a girls' night. As soon as their parents went to sleep, they intended to quietly sneak out of the house and go to a nightclub. After giving her parents a goodnight kiss, Isobella walked upstairs to get ready for bed. When she assumed that everyone had gone to sleep, she took out her cell phone, contacted her friend Chloe, and told her to meet her at the store down the street. With that, Chloe hung up the phone. Isobella carefully opened her bedroom window, trying not to wake anyone. She walked out onto the ledge and climbed down the drain pipe. As she strolled along the quiet street, she got a peculiar feeling that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck pricked up. She peered behind her, but she was alone. When she came to the corner store, there was nobody around, so she took out her cell phone and contacted Chloe. "Okay, I'm at the store," she said. "Hurry up, or I'm going home." "What's wrong?" inquired Chloe. "I don't know," responded Isobella. "This just doesn't feel like other nights. Something isn't feel right. I've got a horrible vibe." "Stop it. You're just being paranoid," laughed Chloe. "I'll be there in 2 minutes." Isobella shut up the phone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. 5 minutes later, Chloe turned up and the two females strolled together to the nightclub. The girls were too young to enter inside the club, yet the bouncers never asked them for a ride. They stepped inside and pretty soon, they were dancing to the music and flirting with males on the dance floor. Around 3 a.m. Isobella was conversing to a really cute guy who must have been at least 10 years older than her. Suddenly, she felt her phone vibrating in her pocket. It was a text message from her ex-boyfriend Anthony. She hadn't heard from him since they broke up a month ago. The text said, "Come outside, I've got a huge surprise for you." Curious, she turned around and noticed Chloe busy talking to some other man. So, without saying goodbye, Isobella walked out the door of the nightclub. She had just taken a few feet when she received another text message. It read, "Meet her around the corner over by the dumpster." The street was poorly lit and deserted. Isobella felt a horrible sensation in the pit of her stomach. Something didn't feel right, but she told herself she was just being overcautious. Inside the nightclub, Chloe was seeking for her friend. After waiting for 15 minutes, she began to feel irritated. She surveyed the dance floor, but there was no trace of Isobella. She even examined the restrooms, but they were empty. At 3:27 a.m., a relieved Chloe got a text from Isobella. "Eat me outside now, hurry." When Chloe got outdoors, she received another SMS. "I am around the corner over by the dumpster, come watch me sparkle." Chloe followed the directions, crossing the dark and lonely street. When she approached the corner, she was confronted by a horrible sight. Her heart practically froze in her chest. Isobella was hanging upside down from a street light in the parking area behind the dumpster. Sparkling Christmas tree lights were draped around her ankles. There was a vast pool of blood below her. Her body was entirely stripped of clothing, displaying serious cuts around her stomach and chest. Chloe collapsed to the ground and began crying violently. Some individuals who were standing at the entryway of the nightclub heard her cries and started rushing over. When they reached the corner and saw Isobella's gory corpse hanging in front of them, they were horrified. The police were called, and they questioned Chloe for hours. Still in a condition of panic, she could scarcely talk. Sobbing hysterically, she told them how she and Isobella had sneaked away that night and gone to the nightclub together. She attempted to remember all of the boys they had flirted with on the dance floor. They asked her whether she knew of anyone who might want to hurt Isobella, but she couldn't think of anyone. As much as she wanted to catch Isobella's killer, she was of no use to the inquiry. During the interrogation, one of the cops produced a plastic bag and took out a blood-stained envelope. "We found this lodged in your friend's throat. It's addressed to you," said the cop as he handed her the envelope. Chloe was scrawled over the front. With shaky hands, she took out the piece of paper inside and read it. The letter reads, "Maybe if you stayed in bed like you were supposed to, things like this wouldn't happen. Don't go sneaking around at night. Bad things can happen." The cops had to take her before she fainted. An ambulance rushed Chloe to the hospital, and she was treated for shock. When Chloe returned home the next day, she was still rattled. Her parents told her that Isobella's ex-boyfriend, Anthony, had been arrested for the murder. He was later released after passing a lie detector exam. He said his phone had been stolen on the day of the murder. The police didn't rule him out as a suspect in the case, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge him. As fate would have it, Isobella's murder would remain unsolved. Nobody was ever brought to trial for the crime, and as time went on, people began to forget about it. 2 years had passed, and Chloe had nearly managed to forget about the dreadful night when her best friend had been viciously killed. One night, she contacted her lover and requested him to meet her at the park. It was about 2. She began to walk to the park, but sensed a strange presence, precisely like the one Isobella had told her about. The night she was slain. She was close to the park when the feeling came across her, so she let it go. Her phone beeped. It was a text message from her boyfriend. "Almost there, baby, love you lots." It made her feel considerably better. Her last assignment was to pass by the store. The park was on the other side. She began to walk but heard something behind her. Immediately, she began to run. Her partner got to the park and waited for around 15 minutes. At 2:35 a.m., he got a text from Chloe O. It read, "Walking forward and you will see me." He did as the instructions instructed and walked forward. There, hanging upside down from a tree, was the disfigured body of Chloe. Christmas tree lights were tied around her ankles, and she was absolutely naked and drenched in blood. He phoned the police and was grilled all night. The next day, when Chloe's boyfriend returned home, there was a note waiting for him on his parents' porch. It was smeared with little drops of blood. Don't go sneaking around at night. Bad things can happen. I wish I could tell you that the murders of Isobella and Chloe were solved, but that's just not the case. Today, the police say the inquiry is still ongoing, but they have no news. The murders are seldom spoken about nowadays. They were high-profile cases at the time, but due to the peculiar lack of proof, people soon forgot about them. Everyone who was involved carried on with their lives. You may be asking how I know so much about these cases. Well, I'd rather not go into that, considering it is still an active inquiry. If you must know, I was the cop who was assigned to the case. I was the cop who handed Chloe the blood-stained letter. You may also be asking why the killings were never solved. Well, like I always say, don't go snooping about at night. Bad things can happen. The Grither is a frightening Christmas story about a legendary monster who lives in the freezing wastelands of the North Pole. It is based on the episode Seasons of Belief from Tales from the Dark Side. The family was assembled in the living room on Christmas Eve. The father was reading the newspaper as his wife knitted a sweater. Jimbo and Steffa, the children, were laid out on the floor with their crayons and coloring books. "Tell us a story," asked Steffa. "Yes, it was a scary one," Jimbo emphasized. "All right," their father said. "I'm going to tell you about the most terrifying, dangerous, and horrifying creature in the universe. And its name is Mr. Grither." "Oh, now you've done it," their mother exclaimed. "You said his name out loud." "Who is he?" Jimbo inquired. "He's the most awful thing in the world," their father declared. "He lives in the North Pole in a cave. The Grither lives in the coldest, wettest place on the planet. He sleeps in the wreckage of a ship that has become trapped in the cave's mouth. He doesn't mind the cold or the rain, but the thing he despises the most is hearing his name called. He has really good hearing, which grow larger every time his name is pronounced anywhere on the planet. His ears can sometimes grow so large that he can fly." "I don't like this story," Steffa grumbled. "It's too late now," remarked her mother. "His name has already been mentioned. The Grither is most likely on his way to our house right now." "It will probably take him a while to get here," their father said. "Everything will be fine if we finish the story before he arrives." "Do you know why it's called the Grither?" "Why?" the children inquired. "Because he has fists the size of basketballs and arms the length of boa constrictors," their father chuckled. "Whenever he sees people calling his name, he opens his fists and reaches out his arms, grithering them in. He grabs their heads and squeezes them till they pop like a balloon." "Does he look like Bigfoot?" Jimbo inquired. "No," his father answered. "He's not like Bigfoot, nor is he like the abominable snowman. Nobody knows for certain what he looks like. The only humans who have ever seen the Grither are those who have been eaten by it. He's as tall as a tree, but he can reach out and touch the ground. Because his skin is transparent, all of his blue and red veins show through, giving him the appearance of a road map. The blue represents dread, while the red represents fury. "Hurry up and finish the story before he gets here," shouted Steffa. "The Grither was born on a sailing ship," her father explained. "A storm blew it off course, and it became lost in the Arctic Sea. They sailed for weeks and saw nothing but glaciers and icebergs. Some of the passengers drowned. Others died from exposure. Some went hungry, and the remainder committed suicide. The Grither arose from all of those people's fear and wrath." "But why does he kill people?" Jimbo inquired. "Nobody knows," his father remarked. "He just doesn't like anyone telling his story." "Is that all?" Steffa inquired. "Is that the end of the story?" "Not quite," her father replied. "There's only one way to protect yourself from the Grither." "Maybe you should stop," their mother intervened. "I think you've scared them enough." Their father laughed. "You don't believe in the Grither, do you?" "That's what he said." "No," the kids said. "Well, you shouldn't," their father explained, "because I made everything up. The term the Grither does not exist." "But you didn't finish the story," Steffa moaned. The front door blasted wide, and the room was engulfed in a cold blast of wind. There was a bang and the sound of glass shattering. Then, through the windows, two massive gnarled arms came in and grabbed their parents by the heads. As the youngsters watched in horror, their parents' hands squeezed and squeezed, and their heads popped like two balloons. Clarice is a sad and scary poem for Christmas about a man and a woman who live in a shack in the woods. It appeared in Creepy Magazine 77, Christmas 1975. It was written by Bruce Jones with art by Bernie Wrightson. In the desolate cabin, ensconced within winter's icy clutches, the haunting refrain of Gone reverberated through the air, a four-letter lament that encapsulated the man's profound loss. As he faced the bitter chill, a word, a thought, a breath of air became a poignant reminder of a love that had slipped away. The narrative unfolded against the backdrop of a black December, each passing moment a somber echo of December's past. The specter of the man's beloved lingered, a pale and tender ghost refusing to fade into the recesses of memory. Shared laughter in raindrops, the whimsy of springtime, the warmth of summer, and stolen kisses beneath autumn's daring canopy played in a bittersweet loop in his mind. Yet, as evening descended and stars pierced the cold night, the specter trembled like a fragile flower beneath winter's icy shroud. Relentless snows claimed once more what was dear to him, the very essence of his life, his single heir. In the chill awakening of the cabin, he sought solace through desperate, drunken prayers, haunted by guilt and driven by an inexplicable compulsion. Stumbling to the familiar oaken walls, the man found himself ensnared by nightmares that clung to him like shadows. The fireplace flickered with flames that danced to the rhythm of shared moments. Things said and done, etched forever in the recesses of his tortured mind. Through the haze of wine's gay prison, he remembered her light in firelight's red glow, the bitter night quest for firewood, and the descent into the warmth of Christmas bed. The door had closed behind her, unheard, and she had vanished into the winter night. As the seasons cycled through the tableau of his grief, the man found himself imprisoned within his own despair. Madness descended with an icy blow, and he relived the torment of her agonizing departure, the sound of her pounding fists against the oak wood, phantom claws refusing to let go. In the field of desolation, beneath ice-covered limbs, he laid her silent figure to rest. Her screams echoed through the night, the pounding flow of phantom fists persisting through the day. His mind, tortured and frayed, yearned for the fleeting touch of what once was. As he stood on the frozen doorstep, his sanity teetering on the edge, he imagined her beckoning with amber eyes. In the depths of his despair, he questioned whether his anguish reached her, whether she heard his pain. If only he could see her once more, hold her fragile form in arms decayed with wanting, and hear her voice console him. The man yearned for a glimpse of his beloved, a chance to feel her touch while he yet lived. He wished for her wandering spirit to claim him, to end the torment that bound him to the mortal husk. If only she could stand before him, if only she could say the words that would release him from the chains of guilt. Beloved husband, I forgive. The Sock Puppet is a spooky Christmas story about a wealthy man, a sickly daughter, a cold winter, some angry villagers, and a mysterious Christmas present. Many years ago in Ireland, there was a wealthy guy who lived in a little village. He owned every single plot of land surrounding the settlement and rented them out to poor farmers at a tidy profit. The father lived in the biggest house in the hamlet with his attractive wife, his two strong boys, and his small, sickly daughter. He was friendly to all of his children and treated his wife like a queen. However, in business he was ruthless and crafty. He gained a lot of money by charging the locals excessive rents and treated all of his tenants as if they were slaves. If any one of them was behind with their rent, he would kick them out of their houses without a moment's warning. The peasants detested the rich man and despised his nasty and miserly ways. He often gave elaborate parties, inviting just his friends and family, and lived like a king, while the poor peasants had to scrape and save simply to keep their mouths filled. All they could afford was a modest diet of bread and potatoes. One year, there was a potato blight, and all of the crops were devastated. As winter crept in, the peasants were starving to death. The affluent man paid no attention to the complaints of his renters and replied by raising the rents. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he arranged a Christmas party for his friends and family, where they had an enormous feast and drank sarcastic toasts to the misery of the starving tenants. That night, one villager arrived at the door with a present. He stated it was a Christmas present for the rich man's daughter. The girl opened the box and found a sock puppet inside. The peasant claimed he had knitted himself and asked if he would have some food. In response, the rich guy handed the peasant one lonely, solitary potato and sent him on. Although it was a nasty old rag, the daughter seemed to appreciate the sock puppet. She named it Charlie and put it on her hand, presenting it to everyone at the party. That night, once the celebration was over, the father was retiring to bed. He paused at his daughter's bedroom door and gazed in on her. She was fast sleeping. Just as he was about to go, something concerned him. The sock puppet was still on her hand, and its plastic eyes seemed to be peering straight at him. He disregarded it and walked away, thinking he was only imagining. That night, as the affluent landlord and his wife slept in their chamber, they heard a knock at the door. It was their daughter. "Mama, Papa," Charlie says, "he needs to speak with you," she added. They saw their daughter walk in, blood streaming from one hand and the sock puppet on the other, glaring at them both. "Charlie already spoke with Jacob and Michael," added the daughter, moving the sock puppet's mouth as if it was speaking. "Now he must speak with you." For weeks, the rich man's mansion sat strangely silent. The villagers noticed no candles in the windows and no smoke from the chimney. Eventually, they decided to check on the family, and what they saw stunned them to their very core. In the living room sat the two brothers. Both powerful young men had had their heads twisted off and placed on their hands as if the heads were puppets. The same had happened to the parents, who were found dead and decomposing in their beds. The most frightening sight of all was the small girl. She was seated in the corner of the bedroom, her severed head perched upon one palm, smiling sweetly with her eyes wide open. On the other hand was the sock puppet. Due to the rigor mortis, her arms were jutting out, and it seemed as if the two hands were conversing to each other. Just recently, a family moved into the residence. They went to the country because the family doctor indicated it would help their ailing kid recover from her sickness. Everything was well, until one night, when the mother heard the girl reaching out to her. Before the mother opened the door, she heard her daughter conversing. She peeked in and the girl was sound asleep. "What did she need, honey?" inquired the father when his wife returned. The mother stopped before speaking. "I have no idea," she said. "The poor little thing must have been talking in her sleep. Do you know where she obtained that terrible sock puppet?"